We're in the Element Well Studios on the final day of a January of the first month. That's the first month of the year. The legislature down there in session. And, of course, this time of year, the governor of the great state of Mississippi comes forth and delivers a State of the State address. And that's why we got Lucien Smith, former chairman of the Mississippi GOP, in the Element Well Studios to break that down for us. Good to see you, Lucien.
Hey, good to see you too, Gerard. It's always great to be on this side of the of the setup here. You know, there's not quite as much pressure over here.
I agree, but you've been handling that quite effectively.
Well, I've enjoyed doing it.
Appreciate it. Appreciate you filling
absolutely.
in for Paul and for me as that occurs, and you do a fantastic job.
Yeah.
But I know, like me, you have learned to appreciate. This is kind of hard, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely it is. And you always appreciate a gregarious guest. You know, you get somebody on, you'll ask them a question, they go, yeah, you're right. You think, well, we got 12 minutes to the next break. I'm going to need a little more than yes, if I can get a little more out of you.
Yeah, that's precisely right. But, of course, the folks here do a great job of lining up fantastic guests for us. We just had the Collins Fire Chief and the president of the Mississippi Firefighters Association, John Pope, on the program discussing HB 521, which would establish a program, a length of service award program for volunteer firefighters. And
interesting.
It would be funded with just a slight increase to the diversion of the fire insurance premium tax, which funds, of course, the fire services in the state. It would divert a sliver of that on an annual basis. About $4.8 million is what I saw in the bill.
Interesting.
To fund this program, with the goal being to serve as a retention tool, keep those folks around, because they're hard to come by. I mean, all jobs are, of course, these days, but in particular, keeping people who you've invested so much in to train them and serve as a firefighter. And they obviously don't do it for the money. They're volunteer firefighters.
Right.
But a little financial incentive if they to stay around 20 years in this case, I think makes sense. But we'll see what happens down there at the legislature. Okay, so yesterday the governor did what any chief executive does when they deliver a state of their particular organization over which they manage. I did the same thing. I used to call it the State of Venture address when I would address our entire team and talk about just how we did. And you always got to start off with pointing out the victories, the successes. Right. And the governor, I think, did a very good job of that. And the one thing that I'll offer before I let you analyze is this governor seems to have a better feel for and an appreciation for the value of the private sector. I think as much or more than any prior governor. It seems to be a high focus, area focus for this governor. And he talked about some of the successes in his speech yesterday, as he should.
Absolutely. And I think that's right about Governor Reeves. I mean, he is somebody, he's very much like you or me from the economic liberty school of thought. You know, he recognizes, and I've heard him say this before, he didn't say this explicitly last night, but that government doesn't create jobs. Government creates an environment in which jobs are created. But yeah, he did a lot last night about talking about the successes of his administration, which is what you would expect in a state of the state. It's especially what you'd expect in a state of the state in an election year. In a lot of ways, you know, these weren't campaign speeches. This was an official speech by the governor in his capacity as governor. This Commissioner Presley's response was the Democratic Party's response to the Republican governor. But if we're being honest, at some level, this was the opening part of the conversation about the 23 governors race.
Sure.
And anytime you have an incumbent running for re-election, there are really two questions people look at. The first question is, do folks think the state's heading in the right direction? And then secondly, if people don't think it's heading in the right direction, is the other candidate, the person who's not the incumbent, someone you trust to get it going in the right direction?
Yeah.
And so you're going to hear a lot from the Democrats and their allies in the media between now and November tearing down Mississippi, pointing out things that are wrong in the state or things they can frame up as being wrong, because they want voters to go in the voting box in November and say, no, things aren't heading in the right direction. We need to make a change. And so I think, you always get a celebration of successes in these kind of state of institutions, state of the union, state of the state, state of a company type speeches. But I think you're going to hear a lot of that from Governor Reeves this year, both because he has great successes to talk about as governor, but also because there's going to be a very large media establishment that's trying to push a narrative that, Mississippi's in a really bad state, that everything's going terrible, and it's all because the Republicans are in charge. And I think that'll be one of the things you'll continue to hear from him fighting back on this year. Yeah,
totally agree. He opened up by saying, not too long into his remarks, and I'm quoting, "As you've heard me say before, the way we measure success is in the wages of our workers, the success of our students, and winning the war on our values." I mean, that pretty much sums it up.
That's right.
And he goes on to say in the next paragraph, and it's looking at the transcript, but his following remarks, he pointed to the increase in per capita income in Mississippi, $7,000, almost 18% over the last 3 years since 2019. I'm so pleased to see this, Lucien. And folks that tune into the program know that many times I've actually called for the posting of a digital signage in the chambers with our household income and our per capita income that are live in real time and are updated, with their focus being on, you got to watch that thing, you got to push that thing up, because, and our rank, by the way, because as you know, we've ranked at the bottom in both categories.
Absolutely.
We've made progress, and the governor's right, and I appreciate his work to elevate our household income, our per capita income. But we got, and he acknowledges this, we got work to do, but just that he's focused on it and actually cites the figure in his State of the State. I can't remember that ever being done before, and so I applaud him for that.
Yeah, well, and Governor Reeves is a numbers guy to begin with, and so he's going to be most comfortable talking about numbers. But to your point, that is one of the most meaningful metrics.
Yes.
And he talks about specific specific major projects that have come to Mississippi. But if you're not seeing an increase in average wages in the state, it doesn't matter to you if you're in Southwest Mississippi that there's a new project in Corinth. What matters is, are you able to provide for your family at least as well, hopefully better now, than you did 4 years ago? And if when you're able to point to those sort of specific metrics, and the governor can do that, both because that's the way he thinks, but also because he has good statistics to point to, you're going to see a lot of that. So I think we'll hear a lot of that continuing over the course of this year.
Otherwise, we're just shuffling the deck, and that's the point. But I'm serious in that our folks in the legislature in both houses, I want to put a big old sign in there. And I'm actually not kidding about that. I want you to know that. I think it's meaningful because, as you point out, it's both a measurement of success and a goal.
That's right.
It's kind of has a dual purpose in that respect. So many of the state's issues are addressed. Many are conquered as we watch that household income, per capita income go up.
That's exactly right. You can point to so many other areas of the state, policy areas where people have interest and concerns, and as that per capita income increases, it allows you to address those other issues.
Exactly.
And that's part of the reason we've had a $4 billion surplus in the state treasury, because we have people making more, buying more, paying more in income tax because they're making more income. And that allows you to address some of those other problems, including continuing on tax relief. That's right.
Yeah. So when you look at education, crime, healthcare, we have, unfortunately, the highest uninsured rate at about 11% of the 50 states in the country. But you know what? When you see household incomes and per capita incomes go up, that's because people are working. They're generally working where employers are able to provide them insurance, and that figure then goes down, which takes the pressure off the healthcare industry. So it's all inextricably linked to the economic engine of the private sector.
Yeah,
and the governor gets that. So I applaud him for that. We've got Lucien Smith, the former chairman of the Mississippi GOP, in the Element Wealth Studios. We're coming right back. We're visiting with Lucien Smith, former chairman of the Mississippi GOP, and we're talking about the state of the state. We'll get to Brandon Presley's response in a minute. But so we sort of covered the private sector aspect. You remember vividly during the campaign, the governor said we want to make Mississippi the best state of the 50 in which to do business. Not sure if you had a chance to read it yet or not, but I wrote an article to that effect a couple of weeks ago, published on our SuperTalk website, just discussing my business experience of starting a business in Mississippi and building it, and claiming essentially that, yeah, this is a good place to set up shop and do business. And all the folks that say you can't do that, well, I'm sort of living proof that you absolutely can.
That's right.
And so the governor, I think, is right to point that out, and I guess applaud him for his efforts there. Let's talk about education. What do you think about that?
Well, look, I mean, that is, if Tate Reeves were a Democrat, if Phil Bryant were a Democrat, you would be seeing long-form stories in local media and national media about the Mississippi Revolution in education. And we hadn't solved every problem. Not every child in Mississippi is getting the education that they ought to get. But we are seeing the fruits of the 2013 Education Reform Act, the Education Works Bill that was the centerpiece of Phil Bryant's agenda that year that passed with the support and hard work of Governor Tate Reeves and of Speaker Philip Gunn. And we're starting to see that come to fruition. And the governor gave several statistics, but the one that stuck out to me as the most significant is that the fourth grade math scores of African American students in Mississippi is number 5 in the nation. As I understood it, not number 5 for improvement, but the raw scores are number 5 in the nation. And we're so used to hearing, especially from folks on the Democratic side, that Mississippi's education system is terrible, that we're the bottom and laughingstock of the nation. And there's still improvement to be done, but we have seen real successes under Republican leadership. And I would remind people, Republicans only took control of the legislature in 2012, and it was tentative control. So one of the first things they did was that massive 2013 Reform Act, and we're starting to see the benefits of it now. And what I was struck by, and I know we haven't gotten to Commissioner Presley's response, but I was struck by how little he talked about education. And I'm certainly not suggesting that's not an interest of his, but these speeches generally, on both sides, you got a fair amount of polling data that tells you what's important to people. The fact that we're not hearing more about education, I'm guessing, and I hadn't seen any recent data, I would guess that people are cognizant of the fact that we've made gains in education over the course of the last decade, and people are satisfied with the way we're headed. Not saying we're where we should be, but that people recognize the Republicans being in charge of education is improving the quality of education for every citizen of Mississippi. And so it's just not the political talking point that 5 or 10 years ago it was. I mean, that's pure supposition for
I think
me,
that's
but
right.
I think I suspect that's the reason.
Well, I think the difference is the data support it. And so it's hard to refute it when you've got substantiating data.
That's right.
And we didn't have that when we first got control.
That's right.
So now we do. We have some history. We have some experience. And it's all positive, and the trends are positive. So I think the governor was right, obviously, in calling attention to that. We were talking about it off the air during the break. It's half the budget.
That's right.
I mean, the state government is half in the education business, and that's consistent with all the states.
That's right.
Public education is a big mission area of the state government.
But the big change that came because of Republican leadership, and Governor Reeves deserves a great deal of credit for this, is we stopped focusing on what we're putting into the classroom and started focusing on what's coming out of the classroom.
Sure.
And that has been a paradigm shift that's very different from the Democrats. And so, their talking point for years and years and years was that the education formula wasn't fully funded. And so they were able to say we're not fully funding education. Well, that is true, that formula has only been funded twice in the 25 years that it's been on the books. But we're, A, spending more money on education than we ever have historically, but we're funding specific programs instead of funding a formula. But 2, because of things like the third grade reading gate that ended social promotion for students who can't read, we're focusing on changing what's coming out of the classroom, and that's had a transformational impact on folks. So there's more to be done, but I think people recognize that education with Republicans in charge is heading in the right direction in Mississippi.
Yeah, and the governor also has been a proponent of education choice.
That's right.
He's championed some of the legislation that, actually all of it that's in place today that extended school choice, the education scholarship accounts, the dyslexia bill, charter school bill, et cetera. We got a long way to go there, and I think he would admit that and acknowledge that as well. But and it's something to point to. You're seeing it happen across the country, though, in certain states which are breaking away. Iowa, most recently. That was incredible.
Well, and that is something that I personally hope we will see more of in this next term, to get away from this idea that we're funding systems and start funding individual students. And you and I have talked about this before. If you're wealthy, you've got educational choice in Mississippi. You can move to a better district. You can stroke a check to a private school. You have educational choice. The people, contrary to the Democratic talking points, who benefit from educational choice are overwhelmingly low-income Mississippians because they're not able to go buy a $300,000 house in a good district. They're not able to write a $10,000 or $20,000 check to go to a private school. They are going. Their child is trapped unless they've got a charter school they can get to. They are trapped in that district, going to the school in their attendance zone, and moving the way Iowa has and some of these other states towards funding students, I think will continue the transformational work that's being done in Mississippi on education by the Republican Party.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. And often they don't have the transportation as well to get them to a different school. So hopefully we'll continue to make positive progress there. And I think that you would agree with this, Lucien. The governor keeps up with what's going on in the other states, his peers, and he's number 2 person in the RGA, I believe,
I think that's right.
Republican Governors Association. So he's watching what's happening in Iowa. You know he is, and right that he should.
That's right.
Utah, too, also just expanded their education scholarship accounts and school choice. The state of Iowa, we are ahead of them with respect to, I did some research on that, of reducing taxes, but the governor there's got her sights on bringing the taxation down on both individuals and corporations even more. So, and the governor talked about signing into law the historic tax reform bill last year, but also acknowledged that there's more work to be done there. Something else he brought up, Lucien, get your take on this, is he referenced the certificate of need laws. He seemed to show he's in favor of repealing those. I don't know that I've ever seen him make quite as strong a statement as he did yesterday. Certificate of need laws.
That was my reaction too. I mean, I have always assumed that Governor Reeves would support repealing certificate of need laws for that same reason we were talking about earlier, that he's an economic liberty type conservative that would be bothered by that sort of protectionism. But I don't. If he has previously expressly called for repealing those laws, I don't remember it, and I think it
certainly
makes sense.
Did yesterday.
That's right. No, I mean, I think he was very clear last night. He supports repealing it, and it comes in this context where the Democratic message is the way we save health care in Mississippi is to expand Medicaid, and so I think this was part of, and he was explicit that this was one of the ways of addressing the issues we've got with rural hospitals was blocking folks from coming in and having real competition and use the power of the free market to help solve some of these problems. So clearly that's one where there are a lot of solutions that are out there, but I thought it was interesting to hear him be that explicit on what is a very, very controversial issue. And to his credit, it's a lot easier in an election year to stick to the meat and potatoes, popular issues. But, I mean, you start talking about certificate of need, you have strong opinions out there. Very
strong in opposition thereof, and that's why we hadn't gotten anything done, honestly. But he started out his comments regarding that issue with, it starts with leveling the playing field. Absolutely.
That's
and
right.
This is a situation where government is controlling the playing field. They've set the rules such that we don't have a free market in healthcare delivery. He also made a reference which was just really made me so pleased. He made a reference to technology and the change in technology. Now, you and I have talked a lot about this HB 401, the bill that would severely restrict the sale of new vehicles in the state of Mississippi, which is being driven by advances in technology. And the governor talked about that, and I think I'm fully aligned with him that whether it's healthcare or retail or manufacturing or any other industry, even the legal industry, they're all being disrupted by technology.
That's right.
And it's government's job to get out of the way and embrace it, not try to block it. He said that yesterday. He sees that.
He did.
As a solution.
He gets it, and I think what he understands at a fundamental level, and there is an analogy to the CON law. It's rare where you see protectionism grow economic prosperity. What grows prosperity is competition in a free market.
We'll catch more about Governor Reeves' speech yesterday, and then we'll get to Brandon Presley's as well with Lucien Smith in the Element Well studio. Mississippi, Lucien Smith, our guest in the Element Well studios. All right, so Lucien, well, I think we've anything else you want to say before we move on to Brandon Presley's remarks?
One other thing I would point out from Governor Reeves' State of the State that I was struck by and appreciative of was his talk about the capital city, the need to increase the Capitol Police Force here because, one of the things that the Democrats talk a lot about, but you hear it sometimes from Republicans, is the so-called brain drain where people are leaving the state to go somewhere else, and you can get in the weeds and argue about how accurate the numbers are that are being offered, but there's no doubt that we've got talented young people coming out of Mississippi colleges and universities who are choosing to start their career somewhere else, and what we know is that a big part of that is that young people want to live in cities.
Yeah.
They want to start their career somewhere that is exciting and big and offers things that don't happen in a suburb or a small town. You get to be my age, you kind of want a quiet suburb, small town feel to raise your kids in.
Yeah.
But kids are not looking at Jackson and getting excited to come here because of a lot of the problems that we've got. Not the only problem, but one of them is crime. And I think it's great that Governor Reeves and state leaders are making an investment and are focusing on what they can do to make Jackson a better place to live. I'm biased because I live in the city of Jackson, but what we know happens is these kids go to Nashville, Birmingham, Atlanta to be there in a hip town, and then they meet the person they want to marry, they have kids, and pretty soon they've lived in Birmingham or Atlanta or New York City, and that becomes where they live. And if we could have more people who said, Jackson's a big city, let's go to Jackson and live there, that seems like a good place to start out at 24. Not going to get every one of them, but I think that commitment both addresses the real humanitarian issue in Jackson with crime, but it also, I think, will have dividends down the line as more people choose to stay in state because they see a big area where they can come live.
Yeah, and it's an economic issue as well.
That's
as the
right.
population ages, we've talked about that on the program. Japan and China are both experiencing this where their populations are aging and they ain't producing enough young people to take over. And Elon Musk has warned, we're running out of workers, folks, because we're not as inclined to propagate as we once were.
That's right.
And statistics bear that out.
And I'll say in Elon's case, he practices what he preaches. He's
right.
Got 8 or 9 kids, I think.
You're right. He sure does. So something else before we get to Brandon Presley's remarks. The education situation in the state, just get your take on this. It appears to me that our K-12 education, for the most part, is geared towards preparing a student to go to college, which I think is great. Now, we all know there are lots of other job opportunities besides getting out of high school with a high school degree and going to college and following that more traditional route and then seeking a job that you've been prepared for with your college degree. Sure, there are lots of other vocations that make sense for people. But I think it's great that we're improving public education in the K-12 levels. But if all we're doing is getting them to college and getting them better prepared to succeed in college, only to watch them exit, the state's not really benefiting from that long term.
That's a valid point.
If they don't stay, I think it's great. We certainly want our youth, our children, our students to be better educated and have a higher quality intellect and intellectual capacity. But we're sending them to the other states, unfortunately. Yeah. So we're not getting the value of that long term.
That's right. We do have a lot of people leaving, and I think one of the ways you fix it is making Jackson a better place for people to want to come. And another one is talking more about the good things that are happening in Mississippi, because it is, nobody. I gave a speech to a group of high school kids last week who were in town and made the point to them that if you're 17 years old in New York, Atlanta, Paris, France, you think wherever you are is the worst place to be. I mean, that's just the nature of being 17 or 18. You could be in the coolest, best place ever, and you'd hate it, because that's what you do when you're 17 years old.
That's right.
And we need to do a better job of talking to our, in addition to making sure the opportunities are here, and I think Republicans are doing that, we also need to do a good job of talking to young people and helping them realize that. I mean, this is a great place to build a business, to have a family, and but that needs to be one of our focuses, to make sure more people are staying here and doing that.
I'll send you my article, and I hope you'll distribute it as you see fit,
please,
as well, because it's from the heart, honestly, and it's
well, and you've lived it.
Yeah,
it's not, and I'm not knocking people who haven't who are in public life, but I mean it is meaningful hearing that, especially meaningful hearing that from somebody who's got a firsthand perspective on it.
Yeah, and the point is, you too can do this.
That's right.
Nothing special here. You can do it as well. The opportunities avail themselves. So overall, I thought the governor's speech was somewhat predictable, although I think we would agree he touched on some things that you and I would agree are positive that we maybe didn't expect, such as
like the CON.
The CON is an example, and certainly his acknowledgement that, hey, technology is uprooting the world, and we got to embrace it. We can't just stand in the way of it. So he did well that. So Brandon Presley, the first thing Rhino and I talked about yesterday, maybe you can help us with this solution, is we can't recall the last time a candidate for governor delivered the response to the sitting governor's State of the State address. We thought that was a little unusual.
That's a valid point. But if you think back historically, 4 years ago, it's the last time a governor was running for re-election was 2015, and there was a primary for governor. And I think that on the Democratic side, there's a primary on the Democratic side. And I think that's one difference you've got now. The last time was 2007 when Haley ran against John Arthur Eves. That here we've got a pretty good sense of who the Democratic nominee is going to be. And I don't know that was the case the last several times.
That's a good point, by default, essentially.
That's right.
So you and I both watched the video, the remarks from Brandon Presley. He's the Public Service Commissioner of the Northern District. Let's be honest, he's a populist. He's a fairly articulate speaker, and he's a real folksy kind of person. And he starts out by talking about his background and where he grew up, and I think he said he was somewhat impoverished. I did not realize until he said it in the video that his father was murdered. Were you aware of that?
I didn't know that either.
At age 7, did he say that? I believe,
I think
or a
that's
young
correct.
age.
But I didn't hear. I was similarly unaware until his announcement video came out.
Okay. So, and then I said on the program here, I know a lot of folks will remember that I really felt like health care and the issues that we are faced with in the state of Mississippi along those lines, that Brandon Presley would make that the top issue in the campaign. He would drive that to the top of the list. Well, he records the video, as you know, inside a closed hospital facility in Newton, Mississippi.
That's right.
And it's dark, intentionally. The lights aren't on, and you can see some medical equipment. It looks like he's maybe in a patient room, perhaps, where the video is recorded. I couldn't tell based on the field of view. But he did, in fact, the main issues he focused on, in my view, were health care, and he talked expressly about Medicaid expansion and the need there. He also talked about elimination of the grocery tax, as opposed to elimination of the income tax, that he thought that was more appropriate, something that could be done right now. And he just also made the point that he's not connected to the so-called rich and powerful. He kind of made a little plug at the end there about that you can just find me anywhere and give me a call and look me up. I'm not going to be underneath the chandelier, of course, referring to the chandelier hanging in the governor's mansion. Of course, if he's elected, he would be, unless he chooses to live somewhere else.
That's right.
Around the rich and powerful, tinkling their glasses, I think, is what he said, or tingling their glasses, pardon me. What did you think?
I mean, look, he's going to run a very populist campaign, and I think the message you saw in his response to the State of the State very much was consistent with what he said in his announcement video. Some of it was the same. It's going to be this suggestion that regular people are getting left behind in Mississippi while the elites are prospering with the Republicans. And I think that's the message he's got to run with. And let me say this. I have no doubt that Tate Reeves is going to be our governor a year from now, but I think anybody who underestimates Brandon Presley is making a huge mistake. I mean, this is somebody who has been elected multiple times in a large district in North Mississippi as a Democrat. Now, I think being a Democrat is going to prove to be a millstone around his neck as we get towards the general election, but Brandon Presley is a very, very talented retail politician. He's a great speaker. He's very likable, and that populist message is going to resonate with some folks. Now, it comes back to what we said at the beginning. People have got to ask themselves, are we headed in the right direction, or are we headed in the wrong direction? And I think the facts are on Tate Reeves' side that Mississippi's headed in the right direction, and I think most people are going to see that come November. But you're going to hear more and more from the Democrats, from Commissioner Presley, about what they can frame up as having gone wrong under Republican leadership. And so I think last night really was the opening of that conversation, and you saw what's going to be the key core messages from both sides.
It was the salvo, no doubt. We've got Lucien Smith in the Element Wealth Studios. We've got a final segment coming up with Lucien after the break. Stay with us. As the government better recognize the skilled labor shortage in our country, as appliance technician, my service call on a local call is $105, $120 an hour labor. I know that's right, Paul. I just had to pay that price last week for some appliance repair at my home. I totally agree. So I wasn't whatsoever dismissing the need and the value of so Paul is one, and of course of the trades, no doubt about it. I'm simply saying that our K through 12 education is pretty much geared. It doesn't mean that you're not preparing a person to seek an occupation in the trades. All I'm saying is I think it's great that we're improving K through 12 education in the state of Mississippi, but unless we keep those people here, we're not getting the long-term return on that investment.
Yeah,
that's the point I'm making.
I agree with you on that point, and I also think we're doing a somewhat better job, and I think Accelerate Mississippi's got some programs along this line of talking to people about going into the trades, because it's a great living.
Yep.
That is what I heard somebody once refer to as 2 cars and a boat kind of jobs. I mean, you have a very, very good life.
Good point.
And there are a lot of people who are taking on debt to get 4, 5, 6 years worth of college, graduate school, who financially would have been much better off if they'd gone to a welding program or gone and learned another skilled trade, where you really are getting into 6-figure jobs that are not going anywhere. I mean, we're unlikely in the short term. Now, there's some efforts I know to bring robots in to change tires and that sort of thing. Yeah. But I mean, we're a long way away from a robot showing up to fix your electrical system, show up to deal with plumbing, show up to weld something. I mean, that those are not going away. Whereas I know they're working on AI to take the place of lawyers. So
yeah,
there may be some lawyers looking into the skilled trades at some point.
It's more than just lawyers, by the way. I've got a couple of great books that talk about that. One is called Human and Machine, that was written by someone that worked at the firm I used to work at a long time ago before I started my business. But it's a fascinating kind of look into the future of how that will uproot everything. I think this governor gets that, though. I will tell you that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I do believe that. All right, Brandon Presley. So it was health care. He made a big point. The other thing, I think, tried to loosely connect the governor to the TANF scandal. And he's going to keep doing that. I think that's politically popular to his base. How effective that would be if he intends to get maybe any crossover voters, not sure.
Well, I mean, at some point you're going to have to be able to really tie it to Governor Reeves. And based on the reporting I've seen, I don't think you're going to be able to do that. I mean, and absent that, I don't think that's going to be as potent. But I think you're right. You're going to hear that over and over and over again between now and November.
Well, it's populist.
That's right.
I mean, that's right down the middle for a populist. I've talked to Brandon before here on the program. He would describe himself as an FDR populist, an FDR Democrat. And I think that I'd say that's probably correct. He also talked about, It is a little unusual, if you think about it, for a Democrat to discuss reducing any taxes. In this case, he proposes to eliminate the grocery tax. I didn't hear him say anything about the income tax. He may have said the grocery tax in lieu of the income tax, but I've never heard him really offer any position on income tax. But grocery tax, certainly.
Well,
made that very clear.
And yes. It comes back to the it comes back to that sort of populism that that we were talking about. That the grocery tax is going to impact middle and lower income people more than an additional income tax cut, at least in terms of direct relief to them as they would perceive it. Now, whether that, if you actually look at the broader economic effect and whether they're going to end up with more money in their pocket, I think is an open question. But I think as a political talking point, that's a very, very good point.
It's a more regressive reduction, I think is one way to put it. And then, of course, that likely leaves a hole in municipal budgets that would have to be discussed and accounted for as well. You may recall that I think there were some amendments offered to the original House bill to eliminate the income tax, which would have also reduced the grocery tax. And they came back, the Speaker did, and said, well, we've got a plan now to make the cities whole for the loss of that revenue. That's where they get the majority of their revenue.
That sales tax gets diverted to, ultimately goes back to the cities as opposed to income tax, which is predominantly in the general fund, absent some sort of appropriation.
Yeah, 18.2% of the total collected by the state of sales taxes goes back to the municipalities where the transaction was completed. But appreciate you coming in, Lucien. We'll have fun with this for sure. I know we'll be talking some more, and you'll be filling in. So
absolutely, George. Great to see you.
Lucien Smith has been our guest as we wrap up middays here from the Element Wealth Studios.